Auzu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum viewers. I'm your host Faiza Naqvi with a prayer. May Allah keep you all safe, healthy and blessed. And may Allah fill this world with peace and justice. And may Allah hasten the appearance of Imam of our time. Inshallah. Ameen. Today the topic we are about to discuss is related to the escalating situation in Gaza and Lebanon, and continuous bombing going on, which is going on in Lebanon, and more than 2,000 people have been killed and injured in these attacks, and the situation is escalating very badly. And and Netanyahu is determined to attack Iran, and it has vowed as well, and he has promised that he will counterattack, obviously, after ballistic missile attack from Iran. So we will see the situation, what he has achieved so far, what Hezbollah is doing, what is the situation of US contribution in the situation of this escalating situation in the region. So we do have a very prestigious guest with us. We have Sister Batul. We will discuss the situation with her, and inshallah soon Sayyid Musa will also join us. Sister, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, I want you to summarize the situation in the region in this past 1 week. What has happened so far? If you can precisely tell us what has been the situation, and what is the United States policy at the moment on the situation in the region?
Right, absolutely. So Netanyahu and his cabinet have been appearing to ride on a wave of high confidence following their intensified bombardment of Lebanon for the past 2 weeks. They have been operating under the assumption that relentless strikes can dismantle the Islamic resistance in Lebanon before it can effectively respond and stabilize itself internally. This strategy has clearly bolstered Netanyahu's popularity within the Israeli occupation entity, including within opposition members. But if Netanyahu believed that the use of mass destruction in Gaza and Lebanon, alongside the targeted assassinations, that you can call them tactical victories, if he believed that that would reverse Israel's failures for the past year in Gaza, then the Iranian missile retaliation that we saw last week, this time, came and took Israel all the way back to square one, because that retaliation from Iran sent a very clear message that Iran is not going to allow the Israeli occupation entity to gain the upper hand when it comes to deterrence. When the resistance axis faces significant hits and intervention becomes necessary, Iran will respond. And the delays in the Iranian response to the assassination that we saw, marked by Iran's initial silence, that also caught the American and the Israeli intelligence completely off guard. They misjudged Iran's willingness to react to the transgression. And now we know that Iran's deterrence has been completely restored in a tangible way. One of America's biggest miscalculations and misconsiderations was that it believed that it could potentially persuade Iran to hold back on retaliating against heinous killings in hopes of achieving a ceasefire in return. But clearly that was not the case, and Iran did not fall for this trap, and Iran reserved the right to respond. And so the scale of the impact on the Israeli occupation entity that Iran's retaliatory strike had was completely significant. We saw many of its military bases, including the Nevatim Air Base, the Tel Nof, the Netzarim, the Glilot, they suffered direct hits, and so this has ultimately created a strategic crisis for Israel, reducing all of the previous successes to ground zero. We know that Netanyahu has spent the past year trying to pursue a kind of military victory to compensate for the intelligence failure on October the 7th. For a whole year, he's aimed to restore the deterrence that he lost on October the 7th he hoped at least that if he didn't achieve anything on the ground in Gaza, that he might be able to achieve something in Lebanon. And we know that the Lebanese resistance actually poses a greater strategic threat to the Israeli occupation entity than any other front does, including the Gazan resistance. But the reality of the fact is that the Iranian missile strikes came and brought everything back to ground zero, to the point where that retaliation from Iran has even compelled the Western powers, who ideally want to avoid a regional war because it's not in their interests, to pressure the entity to halt its aggressive actions. So that deterrence was very, very successful. And if we're thinking about the situation in Lebanon, the reality is that if any military in the world faced the kind of setback that the Lebanese resistance faced in the 10 days, that began 2 weeks ago, where, you know, we saw the pager attacks, followed by the assassination of its top field commanders, followed by the assassination of the Secretary General. Any such organization wouldn't have likely survived. And we know that, you know, Netanyahu has been operating under the assumption that sustained attacks could somehow dismantle the resistance before it has the chance to kind of recover. You know, believing that instability, low morale, this campaign of displacement would also ultimately not just cripple the resistance, but would cripple the people in Lebanon and will turn them against the resistance. We saw that campaign for the past 2 weeks before the Iranian response, that aimed to sow the seeds of sedition. This question of where is Iran? Iran has abandoned its allies. Iran has abandoned the resistance. And we saw also how Netanyahu was reasserting his role in shaping Western policies in the region, using the shock and force. Ultimately, Netanyahu's whole strategy was based on imposing fear. And we saw this ambition was evident at the UN. You know, he presented the maps. He spoke of a Middle East that was shaped by his fantasy, including, you know, the forced transfer of all Palestinians, permanent occupation of Lebanon, his attempts to limit Yemen and Iraq, ultimately cultivating quote-unquote regime change in Iran from within. You know, of course, Netanyahu also believes that if Trump returns to the presidency, that Trump will endorse these kinds of actions and support his achievements. But we saw that Operation True Promise came and significantly changed all of this. And so the battle for Israel right now is existential for the entity. We know its tactical successes hinges on destructive force, technological superiority, intelligence, but ultimately the cost of the losses mount with time and direct confrontation. And the entity will not yield except through force. So if we look at the Islamic resistance of Lebanon, you know, the first phase that it went through in these past 2 weeks was absorbing the shocks, you know, the shock and awe tactic of Israel to hit, strike. In the second phase, the resistance ultimately adapts itself. And in the third phase, it remaintains and takes advantage of the situation and the escalation, emerging even stronger than it was prior to the attacks. So we know that the resistance in the course of the war in these past 10 days has shown, actually, I would argue, very good results on the ground. The military capabilities of the resistance haven't been weakened to a large degree. We're seeing it still strike on average 200 rockets into the heart of the occupation entity a day. And Israel has been unable to ground invade. It's been unable to capture territory in Lebanon. And that is not even looking at the other cards of the resistance that it's not used, you know. So for the Lebanese resistance, that might involve, you know, larger attacks on Tel Aviv. It might involve offensive ground invasions into the entity. It might involve large special operations, expanded sea operations. You know, Yemen and Iraq also haven't shown their full capabilities to the max. You know, these cards are all put on the shelf for the right time if Netanyahu continues with his escalation. And so we know that Netanyahu's drunken high after the killing of Sayyid Hassan, and the assumption that the most important point, that is hitting the head of the body, the idea that that would lead to a full-blown collapse of the resistance, that would enable then Israel to ground invade quickly and to finish the resistance. We know that deterrence has been restored both in Lebanon and both in Iran. But then the question comes over here. If America has been calling for a ceasefire for the past year, Why is America now effectively giving Israel the green light and the free hand to do whatever it wants in the region? The reality is that an entity like America is after Israel achieving objectives. It saw for a whole year it achieved nothing on Gaza on the ground. And with the continuation of time, Israel's falling into a greater pit hole as this war continues, and the components that gives Israel the ability to stabilize as a country and to survive are deteriorating. But America was very impressed in the past 2 weeks with Israel's ability to strike tactical wins against the Lebanese resistance through the assassination of its top field commanders and Sayyid Hassan as well. So America has kind of had this shift in its strategy in redefining the functional role of Israel after decades. Now America is allowing Israel to undertake the tasks that even America itself has been unable to achieve for the past 30 years. We know America 2 decades ago came to the region. It spoke about the quote-unquote new Middle East project, dismantling the resistance in all the countries, toppling Syria, invading Lebanon in the 2006 war, encircling Iran through the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan. So ultimately, we are at a decisive point in history right now. The time has come for Israel, in America's eyes, it's the last straw. Israel has to demonstrate that it can achieve the stated objectives for which Israel was created. So America is giving Israel the free hand in the region to operate as it sees fit. America is telling Israel, achieve this new Middle East project plan, defeat the Lebanese resistance, defeat the Gazan resistance. If you succeed, then you will gain significant rewards. We will allow you to expand your territory to encompass all of Palestine, parts of Lebanon and beyond. And we'll give you the necessary support that you need. However, Israel, if you fail to defeat the resistance, this is what America's saying, this could mark the end of your entire existence in the region with this current trajectory, because the weak has no place in the position of politics, and politics ultimately runs on power and ability. So Israel's at its last straw, and as we know, the resistance will triumph. As Sayyid Ali Khamenei also made this very clear in his speech, that there is no going back. 7.5 decades in, we are in a new stage in the world where Israel ultimately has no space and no capacity. It's a failing and it's a dying entity, and it doesn't suit the new world order that we see right in front of us.
Sister, there are also kind of statements coming from the Netanyahu. He is saying we have killed obviously Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah and his successor, and he's so speaking to the Iranian people through video messages. They did it last week as well, and recently as well, some of his IDF soldiers were speaking to the Iranian people, we don't want to kill you, we don't do this and that. What they are trying to achieve out of these messages, for instance? And they are also obviously saying that we will make Iran as Gaza. And obviously they are bombing Lebanon and killing innocent people, and there is so much destruction ongoing as well, because they can't fight on the ground, but they can obviously fight, they can just bomb and use abuse the power they have. So how do you see these statements? They are just trying to use the tactics of fear, and what they are trying to achieve out of that?
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said tactics of fear. Ultimately, that's how Israel, plans to reign supreme. It's setting the stage for a new Middle East, ultimately in its delusions. We always have to caveat when we talk about what Israel's thinking. Israel is thinking in its delusions. The delusions don't make it a reality. So, for example, when it comes out and it speaks to the Iranian nation directly, it's genuinely thinking that it can mobilize the Iranian nation and cause quote-unquote regime change against Iran. Again, in its delusions. If the Israelis within the occupation entity are turning their backs on Netanyahu and have been coming out in protests in their swathes and 500,000 in the capital of Tel Aviv, what makes him think that the Iranians will even give him a glimmer of attention ultimately. When it comes to Israel moving forward in terms of Iran, in terms of whether this will expand into a regional war, because I think, you know, one of the things that you asserted was that he's talking about turning even Iran into Raza. We have to understand that the Israeli occupation entity cannot survive without American backing. If the US decides to withdraw its support from Israel, the entity will collapse completely. It's inevitable. So Israel's operational boundaries are defined by the American interests. The US is unlikely to engage directly in a counterattack against Iran. America is not interested in that. This means that Israel's response will be limited to what America permits. So consequently, rather than directly responding to Iran in a strong fashion that restores Israel's deterrence, this revenge against Iran is manifesting in heightened destruction of Lebanon and Gaza. You know, and we've seen a whole week delay in Israel's response. Bearing in mind, Israel is not like Iran. Iran has the doctrine of strategic patience. Iran is cold-blooded, it's got a cold temper, takes its time, it's patient. When you least expect it, they strike. Israel, on the other hand, doesn't have these kinds of limitations. It's very impulsive. It operates on the basis of shock and awe, you know, creating this kind of, you know, fear and awe. But we know the reason that Israel is delaying its response is A, because of the constraints from America not wanting it to strike, because America doesn't want this to blow out of proportion into a regional war, because its own interests are affected in the region, its own bases are vulnerable. But this is also because Israel cannot endure for its life a strong retaliatory strike from Iran. This strong retaliatory strike that we saw last week demonstrated Iran's real capabilities to inflict harm on Israel. So should Israel choose to launch a significant attack on Iran to draw America in, we know in that situation, America doesn't want to be drawn. America most likely will kind of want to put a ceasefire on the table. It will say, okay, let's call for an immediate ceasefire in both Gaza and Lebanon in order to bring this war to a halt, because America wants to avoid the situation of a regional war. It's hesitant to engage directly. And also, as we mentioned, we know the resistance possesses still many strategic options that remain undisclosed, you know, surprise, you know, operations from land, air, and sea. But it's been clear right now to America that Iran is able to strike in a very strong and kind of decisive manner. And so the war at this rate, there's really two options. The war will either continue or the war will have to come to a stop. If Netanyahu decides mentally that he wants to continue this war until he establishes, you know, that green map that he held at the UN, this idea of like crushing the resistance and then normalizing with all these Arab countries, and then establishing that kind of security coordination. If Netanyahu wants to achieve that, on the very, very least, this needs years and years and years of more war. This is even if he's able to achieve it. Of course, we know he's not able, but suppose he wants to achieve it. In Israel's own assessment, Netanyahu needs years more of war. In Israel's second assessment, years of more war will lead to Israel's complete collapse. So whatever way you look at it, the entity is, in actual fact, collapsing with time. The biggest war is the war with time itself. We know that more war is leading to more division. It's leading to more deterioration within the entity. Why? Because every failure in goals, Israel sets out goals and it's not achieving them. So, for example, we want to ground invade Lebanon, it's failed. You know, it deteriorates a step more and more. And we know American interests in the region are not hostage to Israel, that they can play with it no matter who is prime minister within the entity. You know, this, in what America considers is a red line for it, and in what Israel can only rely on America to achieve, it cannot operate outside of America's bounds. So let me just give a quick example. You know, America made it very clear to Israel that the forthcoming strike against Iran has to not be strong. America even prefers if Israel doesn't strike. The fact that the strike hasn't happened yet is proof that Israel obeys America when it is unable to act without the American cover. So in the wars that they feel like are greater than they are capable of. So for example, a war with Iran is clearly something that's out of Israel's depth entirely. When they feel that it's greater than the capabilities of their own, even someone like Netanyahu, who's very, very stubborn, is forced to listen to America and ultimately retreats from being offensive And that's exactly what we're seeing on the ground.
Yes, and how about their internal clashes between the supremacist powers, obviously the world leaders who are obviously behind all this genocide, and obviously without their support, no one can do that. And every time we come to the ceasefire, somebody, stops it in some way. So how do you see the French president who said like he should stop and this and that? We should ban like some kind of war, uh, what we can say, weapons. We should not give to the Israel and all that. But but he showed some reaction to French president, and he was quite annoyed in that. So, how do you see? Do you see this war also putting some pressure on Netanyahu in many ways, especially with the allies they have, and what kind of negativity they have in between each other? For example, these powers, obviously, if he is fighting, he is not fighting alone. He has all the world leaders with him. So how do you see this element?
Absolutely. We always have to think of Israel as an American project. We don't think of Israel as this kind of independent entity, this independent foreign entity. It is ultimately a Western project. So from the Western perspective, they always think in terms of interests and in terms of objectives. Israel is there to fulfill the functional role of the West. So they want a strong and thriving Israel. But with time, as we've mentioned, the war is ultimately against time itself. As time goes on, and Israel is not achieving its goals, it is falling into a greater pitfall, and the resistance is only getting emboldened, it's only getting stronger, it's achieving greater successes because the rules of engagement are expanding. So we know the resistance right now is much stronger than it was a whole year ago because it has consolidated many wins on the ground. This year has been a whole expression of live maneuvering where the resistance has enhanced its capabilities, it's understood its strong and weak points, and likewise, it's understood Israel's strong and weak points. So America was not lying when it was calling for a ceasefire for this past year, in the sense that it is in America's interest, it has been in America's interest for this past year for the war to come to an end because Netanyahu was not achieving anything on the ground in Gaza. So from America's perspective, if this war is only making Israel weaker, then it needs to shift from the military front or kind of like the military option to the political option. America's preferred strategy is, the two-state solution, bringing a Western-friendly entity in power so it can achieve some kind of stability. And bear in mind, this is not only a contradiction between America and Israel. Within Israel itself, there is sheer and utter contradictions. So you have the camp of Lapid, for example, like the kind of the opposition, then you have someone like Benny Gantz, and then you have someone like Gallant, who's the Minister of Defense, and then you have Netanyahu, and then Smotrich and Ben Gvir. At one point, Netanyahu even wanted Gallant, he threatened with Gallant that I will fire you and I will sack you because you're not kind of on the same trajectory with me when it comes to this war. So we have to understand, for the past year, Netanyahu has been operating on the basis of his personal interests, and that has what has driven the Israeli society so crazy and created so many divisions within, because they feel like those who represent them don't actually care about them and their interests. I was even reading about an Israeli soldier who he said, I no longer want to live here because I feel like the values for which Israel was created no longer exists. This idea of, for example, security. I don't feel safe and secure over here because if Netanyahu cared about the security of Israel, he wouldn't prolong this war, because with the continuation of war, there are more missile striking and we're more vulnerable. So we have to understand the West thinks in terms of interests. Now, why America hasn't pressured Israel to stop the war is a different matter. America, at times of emergency, sees that if it pressures Israel too much, that can actually weaken it. So, and the last thing America wants is for Israel to be weakened. So, for example, we know that America can overnight stop the supply of weapons. If America really wanted to end the war, it can say, Israel, I'm not giving you any weapons. The reason it doesn't do that, or for example, the reason that it doesn't sanction someone like Netanyahu and put him on the terrorist list, is because taking measures like that will weaken Israel at the expense of what? At the expense of a much stronger resistance. And so from America's perspective, it's forced to walk with Israel's dumbness and blindness, despite the differing strategy. This has been for the past year. However, the escalated tensions in Lebanon have changed the situation. In what sense? In the sense that America has looked at what Israel's achieved and it said, oh, we're quite impressed. We're impressed at the fact that you have managed to assassinate the top field commanders. We're very impressed by the fact that you've assassinated the Secretary General, Sayyid Hassan. That's a great military strategic goal. So from America's perspective, it's thinking right now, okay, we'll give you a free hand. Continue to escalate. All America cares about is defeat the resistance. From America's perspective, it wants a defeated resistance. So America thinks in terms of interests. We know Netanyahu in terms of the interests for Israel. But Netanyahu couldn't care less about what happens to Israel. He cares only about himself. So that contradiction not only appears within American Israel, but within the Israeli society itself.
Thank you so much, Sister Batul. We have Sayyid Muhsin Abbas with us. Thank you so much, Muhsin Bhai, for joining us today. I'm really grateful for your time. The sister was discussing the Western perspective and especially the role of America and whatever is going on from that perspective. I just want to know your perspective for the whole 1 year of genocidal war, which it's not a war actually, it's the genocide ongoing on the Palestinian and is moving on towards the Lebanese people as well. So how do you see if we want to summarize the whole year as they celebrated as an anniversary of 7th October yesterday, and how do you see the whole year? Secondly, sister was explaining like it's not the achievement of achieving some tactical successes is not something we can say is the war goal he has achieved. So what Netanyahu is trying to achieve through this destruction, I mean, when they know they are not achieving anything, so why they are like not only the killing people, journalists, doctors and everyone, but also destructing the whole infrastructure like buildings, hospitals, schools. You name it, and it's like they are trying to do carpet bombing everywhere. So what he is trying to convey out of this whole massacre which is going on in Gaza from 1 year? This is one thing I want to know. And the second thing is Sayyid Ali Khamenei, Rebbe Muslim, last year has given a speech in front of millions of people in Iran. As there were so many rumors they are regarding Ayatollah Khamenei that they are like in fear or something and they are hiding and this and that. So what are the most important messages Sayyid Ali Khamenei's speech has given to the Western world and the powers who are collaborating with Israel?
Well, firstly, Bibi Netanyahu and the ethno-supremacist, racist, Jewish, violent extremist regime, and indeed most of the public that supported him in establishing this label once and for them, have been very successful. They've succeeded in getting that message across to the whole world with live images, live video images, where journalists like me or analysts like Batul, we don't need to even really convince anybody. You know, we spent decades trying to convince people that the Israeli regime was exactly what it is now proving to be. And people would not listen. They were turning a blind eye. They were underestimating. They were thinking we were kind of like laying it on thick. We were partisan. Everything that we warned, conspiracy theories, anti-Semitism, delusion, all sorts of things were thrown at anybody who tried to prove that Israel was what we've said it is. And now I think Netanyahu in the space of 10 months has managed to do what we couldn't do for over 4 decades and 6 decades, for some people 6-7 decades. So firstly, congratulations to Netanyahu for single-handedly being able to decimate all of the hasbara, all of the propaganda of Israel and the Anglo-Zionist West, the trillions of dollars that they spent in trying to build up this superficial image of Israel being some kind of benign, democratic, bastion of equality and freedom and democracy is all been absolutely shattered. So well done, Netanyahu, you've achieved what we've wanted to achieve for years, but the price that we've had to pay is perhaps 200,000 innocent Gazan lives, for which we are saddened, and of course it's a very heavy price to pay. One life in Islam is the equivalent of killing the whole of humanity. So what Netanyahu's done is earned himself in hellfire for perpetuity. So well done, Netanyahu, you've managed to achieve that as well, and all of his regime with them. So there are many achievements. The third achievement he's managed to push through is the destruction of the myth of Israeli power and supremacy militarily in the region. He's destroyed the myth of Mossad and its intelligence, capabilities and their ascendancy and their supremacy in cyber technology fields as well. Because what Iran has done and what Hezbollah have done is they've dismantled most of that, and penetration of their ballistic missiles, their drones, their ability to get surveillance material on all the detailed infrastructure of Israel has already proven that spider's web, which Shaheed Sayyid Nasrallah had constantly alluded to, is exposed. Today you see Yemen's ballistics penetrating, you see the Iraqi resistance drones taking lives of Israeli soldiers daily, and they've done this ethically and morally. If you can fight a moral and ethical war, then this is it. This is the way to do it, i.e. using modern technology to target military, intelligence, and all targets which are to do with the genocidal war machine of Israel, not civilians. And you contrast that with what then Netanyahu's done. He's also managed to show the axis of resistance for what it is, i.e. an ethical, moral resistance force which is fighting for the freedom and the liberty of the Palestinians in Gaza, when nobody else stood up for the Gazans in a holistic way. Nobody. None of the Muslim nations, none of the Western nations, nobody in the world stood up for the Palestinians in the way that the Axis has. So he's also highlighted and managed to clarify that the Axis resistance is the only holistic support unit for the oppressed in that region. And so he's managed to do that for us. Thank you very much. He's also exposed, of course, the realities of Israel's fragility economically. He's had over, I would say, maybe 500,000 to 1 million Israelis displaced. So the people who came and robbed the land and the properties of Palestinians are now crying. All those ones in the north who've been displaced as a result of Hezbollah's persistent, firing on military bases of Israel, they've all gone running to the bunkers, and they're crying now that they're homeless. The irony of it, the irony of it. The Palestinian, the ones who robbed the Palestinians, the settlers who came in to dispossess the Palestinians, are crying about losing their homes. And they're now asking for help to get back those homes. And Netanyahu says, I'm going to invade South Lebanon to create the space for them to return. So now he goes into South Lebanon, and there yet again Netanyahu has exposed the Israeli military, which had the hard lessons taught to them by Hezbollah and the Lebanese resistance in 2000 and in 2006 during their entire occupation of Lebanon during the 80s and the 90s as well. And it's exposed yet again that Israel cannot even go into Lebanon now. The old days, it was like a given that Israel would stomp into Lebanon. Holding it was a different matter even then. But now they can't even penetrate. They tried to do these showmanship style operations to try and get in there into South Lebanon. And before they've even left their own borders, the Ridwan force, backed up by, of course, on the second line, the Badr force, they've already shown that it's not going to happen. Israel's body bag count was so heavy in those early exchanges, they've all gone back to resorting to the most cowardly form of attack, which is to use F-35s and F-16s to go and bomb civilian, urban residences, and to clock up those deaths so they can go back and show their public that actually, look, we killed 2,300 Lebanese and they were all Hezbollah. Yeah, they were all Hezbollah, while Hezbollah is under the tunnels in the underground infrastructure, over 1,000 kilometers of underground infrastructure with a full military capacity intact, yet they're going around claiming that they've killed all these people. Well, if there was ever a hollow victory that Netanyahu is capable of lying about, well, perhaps he can use those civilians and those children as his badge of honor. History, however, will tell a different story. And what we'll see is the Israelis fail to achieve any of their objectives, whether it's hostage collection, whether it's taking over South Lebanon for security, for their security purposes, whether it's the Odin-Yinon plan of expansionism of Greater Israel, whether it's even drawing in the Americans. And if he really puts the icing on the cake, if he manages to persuade the Americans to do the most foolish thing they've ever done in their entire history, which is to go into a war with the axis of resistance on Israel beck and call, then that would be the icing on the cake, because America will get a hell of a beating in West Asia. The whole of West Asia is waiting for American ground troops to mobilize to join this, because people are fed up, and they're fed up of the hegemony and the imperialism, and they are not just fed up, they're equipped militarily, spiritually, faith-wise, to do something about it. And Iraq will be the first place that will be set on fire, where America relies on billions and billions of dollars, trillions of dollars of oil, which it's been plundering ever since Saddam went out of the picture. They take all of that revenue. The Iraqi government gets none of that oil revenue. It's all in the coffers of the Americans. So the Americans want to lose even that, then they're going to go about it the right way by coming in heavy-handed and joining this war. Iran, on top of that, could cause the entire world to go in a spin. The Hormuz Straits would be blown up, shut down. 20 to 30% of the world's energy would mean an absolute disaster in world economy. But coming back to Israel, their economic condition, unless the Americans keep bailing them out, they've given them $10 billion of weaponry since October the 7th. That's been their contribution. But they also contribute, of course, to their welfare state, to their medical care. They can't do it for their own American citizens. They can't even go and respond to the American floods in North Carolina with any real conviction, but they can give Israel everything: medical care, they can give them weapons, they can give them food allowances, they can give them free visas and all sorts of other things. But why is the American nation being neglected by the same establishment that is so keen on getting Israel to do its dirty work in West Asia? It will come to an end, whether it's through a hot war that Israel and America initiate, in which case it'll happen even quicker, or whether it's through the geostrategic war of patience, which the Iranians and the Axis have always preferred, and they've stayed on that steady strategic course. But Israel wants them to go to a hot war, but even that is only, I think, bluff and bluster. They're just showing and saber rattling. In reality, they know they would get an enormous pounding, which would destroy the whole of Israel's infrastructure if they go a step too far with Iran, which has said enough is enough. They're fed up. They're saying, we've given you plenty of opportunity. Do it again. Do go over the red lines and the boundaries that we've set, and we will absolutely annihilate you. And Iran means it.
Thank you so much. Muslim, I'll come back to you then again. Sister Batul, what do you think when I analyze the whole situation in person? I mean, as a common person who is not very well aware of the situation, for instance, then I see like it looks like the might is right is the rule which is going on around the globe, and they justify these rules through, for example, World Economic Forum or WHO or this World organization, that World organization, which are actually just protecting the all the bad things these white supremacists do, and they just protect it through those different organizations. So how would we come out of this situation? For example, as Mohsin Bhai often says, the Rothschild who has created Israel through the Balfour Declaration. If I'm not wrong, I might be mistaken or something. You can correct it. So, and this company and the companies like that have everything we are like consuming, using, eating, drinking. We are the consumer of these companies. So and if somebody wants to do something, for example, you go and try to create something very huge which might be impactful, or and people might go, buy or something, you might not get that opportunity, or you might not be able to go to that extent. Do you think these are kind of webs or something? They are like we can't do anything to come out of this web, or there is something we can do, and we really need to think about the things we should do independently as Muslim world, or even as a common human being, even if one is atheist, because it's not just about Muslim or non-Muslim, it's about humanitarian crisis. And if you look at the like this the kind of people they are, these businesses, Rothschild and the companies, other companies, Muslim Bhai can talk about it better. So these companies have very satanic objectives, and they are doing everything to achieve those goals. Do you think the ignorant people like us are the blessing for them? So how do you think, what is supposed to be done really? Sister, I can't hear your voice, I think so. Yeah, now I
Can
can
you
hear
hear me
you.
now? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
apologies. I was saying it reminds me of the very famous saying of Imam Hussain sallallahu alaihi when he was in Karbala, when he said, at least if you don't have a religion or you don't believe in the hereafter, at least be free in this world. So ultimately, those organizations that you're explaining, or you're referencing, like the World Economic Forum, the IMF, those different institutions through which they control the masses effectively, and control their lives, and program their lives. It is slavery, ultimately. It's how they get away with everything in the world. They create the programs for you. They affect the way that you think, the education system, for example. Exactly as Sayyid Mohsen Abbas said when he put the nail on the head, when he was describing how Israel has effectively become like now a pariah, and all the billions of dollars that was spent on lobbying has effectively come to nil, because the world has now seen the reality for what it is. They've not seen the reality of Israel. They've seen the reality of capitalism. They've seen the reality of the capitalist machine. Because when we talk about Israel is just one tiny little tool in this transnational capitalist class, and one tiny little tentacle that they use to achieve their goals. So, for example, it's enough to just look at Israel's influence. The fact that you have an Israel lobby in the vast majority of the Western world, in all the countries effectively. It's not about like Israel imposing its interests, rather the capitalists created Israel to fulfill their interests, and they see this as a very useful tool. There's ultimately a meeting point here between the Zionist project and the capitalist interests. So, for example, look at the domination of Israel when it comes to Hollywood. Look at the number of movies that are produced by Israeli directors. When it comes to really infiltrating the way that people think and see the world, encouraging the sexualization of society, for example, tactics through which they can numb the world. Like, honestly, like the way that they've been able to get away with 7.5 decades of ethnic cleansing, dispossession, and oppression is because the world's been sleeping for the longest time. And the world sleeps for the longest time through them controlling the whole information narrative. So in many respects, what this war has done ultimately is it has removed those masks of deception, and it's hastened in this very question of creating this new world order. It has shown the world that a new world order can be created on the basis of justice, on the basis of mutual cooperation between countries. And we know that actually the status quo can only change through war, and that is a reality. Maps get carved out of wars. Like, if you see how all of this started, it was World War I when the Ottoman Empire was ultimately defeated on the ground. Because obviously the Brits, the Allied powers, they relied on the stupidity of the Arabs. That's when Britain gained mandate, and that's when they were able to effectively consolidate their hegemonic plans in the region. And so we know that this reality, and this is something that Ayatollah Khamenei also emphasized, that 7.5 decades in, we're seeing a complete reverse, and we're seeing a return back to Israel ultimately like ceasing to exist, like back to point zero to ground zero. So that's happening on the ground. We know that reality is taking place and hearts and minds are changing. But I think in actual fact, one of the biggest tragedies is for the longest time, we've kind of, especially us in the West, we've kind of absolved ourselves from what's happening on the ground. We think of what's happening on the ground, okay, like that, like there is a resistance right there, but we're not connected to it in any way. Like we don't see ourselves as an extension. Like as individuals who live in the belly of the beast, we have our own, you know, as we say in Arabic, your own taklif, you know, your own duties. And your duties, of course, span what's closest to you, like your circle and sphere of influence. So why is knowledge so powerful? Why is narrative so powerful? Because when you wake people up and effectively hearts and minds change and they see the truth for what it is, you know, people would want to mobilize within their respective circles, within their respective spheres. You know, so for example, those who work in corporate companies want to call for divestment. Those who are university students, essentially, we know that for example, the tentacles of the Israeli lobby, they exist in all these kind of civil institutions and private corporate sectors. And so what all that's done is it's opened people's eyes and it's made them think, I cannot continue and stay sane with what is happening in the world. Like this blood is so pure. Like Sayyid Abbas has spoken about the power of this blood and the way that this blood is not cheap at all. Like this is a huge sacrifice that's being given to open people's eyes. It is expected and it is a given that the world can never be the same post October the 7th. It can't. With this magnitude of pure blood that's given on the ground, it's got to give. And that's manifesting itself in the way that people are saying, actually, I would rather get arrested. I would rather get in trouble. You know, I would rather sacrifice my own civil comfort and liberties because I'm going to go insane. I can't live in this unjust world. I can't live in this unjust status quo. You know, the amount of self-immolation, you know, that we've seen from your average white folks because they're just like, I can't deal with the guilt and burden of living in this horrible world. So there is an element for sure of people feeling like there's not hopelessness, but there's this feeling of agency, a feeling that we live in the belly of the beast and there's something that we can do about it. And people keep asking the question of what more can I do? So it's like, okay, I've lobbied in the workplace. Okay, for those who are religious, like I've spoken to the mosque institutions and I said, let's hold some events. You know, the least that we can do is speak up. You know, there's always, people are always asking the question, what more can we do? And that in itself is a sign of the turning point that is happening in the world and the fact that people are awake. And ultimately, we're seeing the reality of victory also manifest itself on the ground because post-war, we're talking about the resistance axis being the ones who are the decision makers in the region because politics runs on power and ability. And only the strong one has a say. So even an entity like America might think, we might want to negotiate or compromise with Iran because no amount of besieging or sanctioning Iran has managed to weaken it or deter it. So actually, if we want to achieve anything in the region and not get kicked out completely, we might have to strike some kind of negotiations of some kind. You know, the powerful imposes themselves. And we're seeing on an international sphere, the way entities like Russia, like China, like Iran, these kind of regional superpowers that are becoming global superpowers, the circle of countries globally that are joining, that are wanting to apply to join, for example, BRICS, that is kind of counterweighing the G20, counterweighing the G7, NATO, the UN. Ultimately, the UN is like the most redundant thing ever. By like everyone's stretch of imagination and everyone's expression, people are like, we want fresh energy in the world. We don't want to be ruled by the American playbook because we know that any Secretary General of the UN is just going to tell the American line, and that's the script. And people get it. People have had enough. People have had enough of even calling out the double standards. It's so blatantly obvious. You know, people are calling out for the hope and the savior and penetrating into hearts and minds. When I think of the hujjah coming, the hujjah will only come when minds are also ready for it and people are asking for it. So I think we're at that cusp of humanity where ultimately we're seeing the turning point reverberate globally because of this pure blood. So in actual fact, you know, as the great martyr mentioned, yaqinan kulluhu khair. You know, certainly it's all good. You know, despite that sacrifice, it's one of the two, victory or martyrdom ultimately.
Thank you so much, Sister Batul. Mohsin, we are ending towards the end of the show. We're just left with 5 minutes only. And the most important question or a narrative I've seen yesterday again is the old narrative, but people say like Hamas is made by Israel and now they funded it and they made it and now they did all of it just to bomb Gaza and then obviously start this war and all that. How do you see this narrative, and what are your conclusive remarks on Rever's speech, if you wish to add something about it, and how would you conclude the whole discussion?
Well, I think I sort of come.
I mean, sorry about. Are we going to see a war between Israel and Iran very soon, or it might be happening after the U.S. election or something?
I don't think we're going to see a war between Israel and Iran. We'll probably see a tit for tat. I think the Israelis have said it, so they're going to have to do something. But if they're smart, they'll only stick to doing minor infrastructure damage to Iran, which they could do, and then they will still get a like-for-like response from Iran, which doesn't want to actually expand the war. They know that Iran where Israel will self-destruct without a war, because no Israeli who has a dual nationality and an extra passport has any incentive to stay in Israel when he knows that he's not safe there. Their heart and soul is not committed to that land. The heart and soul of that land belongs to those who lived in it for generations and who have a complete connection with it. And that's the Palestinians and the indigenous Jews who used to live there and the indigenous Christians. Okay, so first thing is the very nature, the artificial nature of Israel means that it will dismantle itself. They'll all run away. They've already got a million or so who've left the country, gone back to Romania, America, to all the other East European countries and whatever. I mean, I think even Mr. Putin asked his Russian Israelis to leave. I think there's about 3 million of them, or 2 million, something like that. But a substantial number of Israeli Zionists are Russians, and he's told them, get the hell out of there. Basically, whether they listen to him is a different story. So you can see it's an artificial state. You can see that the settlements aren't going to happen anymore because Hezbollah has created the deterrence, and they're not going to be safe in Kiryat Shimona or all these kinds of outlying areas, Ashkelon and all the places that were bombed by the resistance, because the resistance won't stop. The regional war may stop, but you will not see the Palestinian armed resistance, go back to what it was prior to, say, the March of Return, for instance. It will grow. And that resistance will rise in the West Bank. They will not stop until they have equality, until the apartheid state is dismantled, until Zionism is eradicated from that region, because you cannot coexist. Could the West coexist with Nazism after the Second World War? Did they say, let's leave Nazis behind across in Europe? No, they didn't. So in the same way, Zionism cannot coexist because of the nature of the beast. It has an ethno-supremacist and a kind of a religious supremacist ideology at the heart of it, which is incompatible with any humanitarian or civilized state. So firstly, let's park that. It will die its own death. The Axis doesn't need to go to an entire, world war or regional war. So the Iranians will try to avoid that war as much as possible. If Israel goes all the way it knows now, if it didn't already, that they will be totally destroyed even that way, and Iran has promised this. So as far as the other question you raised about narratives, well, the Hasbara of Israel hasn't stopped. The Anglo-Zionist Western media has gone crazy. I mean, Said Marandi has been one of the greatest kind of performers from the Axis. I mean, he's been actually making he's made them look like gnomes. You've had Sky, and I've seen interviews with these on several channels where they keep making the stupid mistake of inviting him, and he goes on and he completely dismantles them, and you can see the faces of a lot of the greatest journalists, supposedly, of the Anglosphere and the Anglo-Zionist imperialists. They're absolutely flummoxed because you can see that they're liars. Their faces tell you they're liars. They're trying to pump out the Hasbara and the propaganda of Israel, but they know it's a lie. So it's on their faces that they're liars, and I think that exposure in itself has been quite fun to watch. But those lies won't stop, and one of the ways that they're going to try to still destroy the region is that same old game, because they haven't got many tricks. They're sort of like not just one trick pony, but the number of tricks they have are now no longer hidden. The sectarian trick, that little trick is still being tried. They've got the Salafists and the Takfirists and all those guys in Syria who were saying we're going to free Syria, for instance. I've seen them coming out of their wormholes now, and they're all talking about how Iran is just is actually working with Israel and is with Zionists, and they're talking desperately about how, you know, Assad needs to be brought down. They still haven't got over the hangover of Assad. Basically, you know, it's all desperation point, and all narratives of trying to create the Shia-Sunni rifts, narratives of trying to make out the, you know, Iranians are all going to overrun Arabia and they're going to convert everybody to Shiism. This sort of rubbish, which they've been harping on about for years, they've scared the Arabs with this nonsense, is not holding weight anymore. Because on the ground, the Arabs are watching that their governments are facilitating Israel's existence. So the UAE and Saudi Arabia have given, through Jordan, a lifeline, trade-wise, to counteract the Bab al-Mandeb, which was shut down by the Yemeni resistance, right? So we've seen Jordan help to bring down some of the missiles that Iran has been sending their way, or the Iraqi resistance. So we've seen Jordanian complicity. You know, this is a nation with a huge percentage of Palestinians living in the country. It's unbelievable. The Egyptians are also in the same boat, where they've been supporting and aiding and abetting. The Turks need a special mention, because Turkey and Qatar are the two who the actual West will fall back on to act as the new players in that region. If Israel can't hold it together, what they want is Erdogan and secular Turkey and whatever, and the Qataris to bankroll a movement in the Middle East, which they take charge of the Arabs rather than the axis of resistance. This is one of the games that is played as well. So there are a lot of games that will still go on. There'll be efforts to create a two-state solution. They'll still try and bring those stupid Abraham Accords, but none of it's going to wash with the Palestinian people anymore, and none of it's going to wash with the real Arab population. So it's that Arab population which needs to reject all of this hasbara, all of this propaganda, and they, like Batul was saying, like we have a responsibility in the West to stand up and be counted. The Muslims in those lands must not continue to be cowards. They must speak up. They must, even if they have to, even overthrow those governments, because the Islamic obligation is not to support the oppressor. And if they cannot support Palestine, then today it's the Palestinians that are getting bombed to smithereens. And had it not been for the axis of resistance, I assure you that Greater Israel, the Odegino plan, would now be implemented, and they would be physically under the rule of Israel. They're artificially under the rule already, because Ali Saud are Zionists. King of Jordan is a Zionist. He's a sworn Zionist. The Turks are Zionists in all but money. They're part of NATO, for goodness sake. Then you've got, who else? You've got the Qataris and the UAE. All of them basically are in the Zionist camp. A lot of them openly and some of them clandestinely. So I know you've got no time left, but I would say that whichever path we go down, the axis of resistance will win. And no matter what propaganda is thrown and what stupidities there are in terms of military efforts, all of it will fail, and all I see is the dawn of the establishment of a genuinely free Palestine and a free Lebanon, free of Zionism, free of all the threats and dangers of the Americans. I see that dawn very, very close now.
That's true. Thank you so much, Muslim. Thank you so much, Sister Batul. I'm really honored to have you both on the show for this such conversation we have today. I'm really grateful for that. And to the viewers, I would take a leave with the note that we really need to understand the situation, and we need to educate ourselves and everyone around us. And not only educate, we need to choose the side. Either we are on the side of Satan, or either we are on the side of Rahman. So the plan of Rahman is going to be succeeded, inshallah. So we need to trust on that. I'll take a leave now. I'll see you next week. Allah Hafiz.